The smell of ozone is quite peculiar when you realize it is the last thing you will ever smell. It is sharp, metallic, and smells a bit like a burnt toaster, which is a rather domestic thought to have when your secret laboratory is currently dissolving into a fireball of neon blue chemicals. Dr. Penelope Thorne, known to the higher-ups in the Ministry of Defense as the Scalpel and to my cat as the woman who forgets to buy salmon, was having a very bad Tuesday. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that life is much like a poorly baked sponge cake. If you don't get the measurements of your life choices exactly right, the whole thing collapses in the middle, and you're left with a soggy mess that even the dog won't touch. My sponge cake was currently exploding. And then, there was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library, or the awkward silence after you accidentally tell a waiter you to when they say enjoy your meal. It was a thicker, heavy, velvet silence that felt like being wrapped in a very expensive duvet. Oh, I whispered, or thought I whispered. I suppose this is the bit where I see the light. But there was no light. There was only a very insistent, very annoying thumping sound, like a rhythmic drum being played by someone who had absolutely no sense of tempo. Thump, 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 thump. I opened my eyes, and the first thing I noticed was that I was not a puddle of singed atoms. The second thing I noticed was that my ceiling had changed. Instead of the sleek, white industrial tiles of the London Underground Biolab, I was staring at a canopy of heavy, moth-eaten brocade in a shade of red that could only be described as angry pomegranate. Ouchie, I muttered. My voice sounded different. It was higher, thinner, and had a melodic lilt that certainly didn't belong to a woman who had spent 20 years shouting over bone saws and sirens. I tried to sit up, and the world did a little somersault. My head felt as though a troop of tap-dancing squirrels had decided to hold their annual general meeting inside my skull. I reached up to touch my forehead and gasped. My hand was tiny, pale, delicate, with long, tapering fingers that had never held a tactical pistol or a heavy-duty defibrillator. These were the hands of someone who spent their days embroidering handkerchiefs and sighing dramatically out of windows. My goodness, I said, my eyes widening. I've shrunk. Or the world has become very, very large. Is this a growth spurt in reverse? Is that even scientifically sound? A door creaked open. It was a heavy, wooden thing that looked like it belonged in a castle, the sort of castle that has secret passages and a very high tax rate. A young woman in a grey pinafore and a white cap scurried in, carrying a basin of water. When she saw me sitting up, she dropped the basin. Clang! My lady, she shrieked, her hands flying to her cheeks. You're not dead. I blinked at her. She was quite cute, in a frantic sort of way, like a startled hamster. Well, I said, trying to sound as reassuring as one can when one has just survived a metaphysical relocation. I was under the impression that death was a bit more final. But if this is the afterlife, I must say, the plumbing seems a bit primitive. The Duchess is awake, the girl cried, ignoring my observation about the pipes. She turned and bolted out of the room, screaming for someone named Master Alistair. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My feet were bare and dainty. I was wearing a nightgown that had enough lace to decorate a medium-sized wedding. As I stood, a sudden rush of memories hit me, not mine, but someone else's. It was like a file download on a very slow internet connection. Her name was Lady Beatrice Halloway, the Duchess of Ravenhall. She was 19, she was terrified of spiders, and she was currently the most hated woman in the kingdom of Ethelgood. Apparently, the original Beatrice had been a bit of a nightmare, petulant, vain, and so desperately in love with her husband, the Duke, that she had tried to poison his favorite mistress. Only, she'd botched the job, poisoned herself by mistake, and then fainted into a decorative fountain. "Oh, Beatrice," I sighed, leaning against a bedpost. "You really were a bit of a goose, weren't you? Poisoning the mistress is so last century. It's much more effective to just give her a very stern talking to about her life choices. Or perhaps a mild laxative." I walked over to a polished silver mirror on the dressing table. The face looking back at me was breathtaking. Heart-shaped, with skin like cream and eyes the color of a stormy sea. It was a face built for tragedy and high-stakes drama. "Well, Penelope," I told my reflection, "you wanted a holiday. This isn't exactly the Maldives, but at least the air isn't full of chemical weapons. Life," I decided then and there, "is like a pair of shoes. If they don't fit, you can either limp around in pain, or you can find a pair of scissors and make some adjustments." And I was very good with scissors. The door burst open again. This time, it wasn't the hamster maid, it was a man. He was tall, ridiculously tall, with shoulders that looked like they had been carved out of granite. He wore a black tunic trimmed with silver, and his hair was the color of a raven's wing. His face was handsome in a way that made you want to check your pulse, but his expression was cold enough to freeze a summer pond. "Beatrice," he snapped, his voice a low growl. "Stop this theatrical nonsense. Your little suicide attempt has failed. You are still the Duchess, and I am still your husband, much to my eternal regret." I looked at him. This was Alistair, the Duke of Ravenhall. The man who hated his wife, the man who was currently looking at me as if I were a particularly unpleasant smear of mud on his boot. I tilted my head, giving him a bright, sunny smile. "Hello there. You must be the grumpy husband. You're very tall, aren't you? Do you find you hit your head on low doorways often? It must be a struggle." Alistair froze, his eyes, which were a piercing, icy blue, narrowed. "What did you say?" "I asked about the doorways," I said, stepping closer. I reached out and patted his arm. His muscles were like iron. "You seem very tense. Stress is a silent killer, you know. You should try some deep breathing, or perhaps a nice chamomile tea. It does wonders for the temperament." The Duke recoiled, as if I had bitten him. "Have you finally lost your mind, or is this another one of your pathetic schemes to gain my attention? Let me be clear. I do not care if you live or die. Beatrice, just do not embarrass the House of Ravenhall again." He turned to leave, but I called out, "Wait. Since I'm apparently not dead, do you think I could have some breakfast? I'm absolutely famished. Dying or nearly dying really works up an appetite. I'd love some toast, thick cat, if you have it. And maybe an egg poached. Please. I find fried food a bit heavy for the soul in the mornings." Alistair turned back, his face a mask of pure bewilderment. He looked at me for a long moment, searching for the screaming, weeping woman he usually encountered. Finding only a cheerful girl who wanted toast, he let out a frustrated huff. "The physician will be here shortly to verify your recovery," he said stiffly. Try not to insult him. "He is the best in the kingdom." "The best?" I perked up. "Oh, how lovely. I do enjoy a good professional chat. I have so many questions about the local apothecary practices. Do you use leeches here? I've always found leeches to be a bit primitive, but they do have their uses in microsurgery, I suppose." Alistair didn't answer. He simply turned and marched out, his cape billowing behind him like a very dramatic curtain. "Well," I said to the empty room, "he's a bit of a sorepuss, isn't he? But he has very nice bone structure. You can forgive a lot of grumpiness for a jawline like that." I sat down at the dressing table and began to hum a little tune. If I was going to be a duchess in a world without electricity or proper antibiotics, I was going to have to make some changes. A divine physician special agent doesn't just sit around and wait for her husband to like her. She takes over the infirmary, reorganizes the kitchen, and maybe, just maybe, starts a small, polite revolution. After all, a rebellion isn't just about swords and crowns. Sometimes, it's about having the best managed hospital in the land and making sure everyone knows that the Duchess is far too busy saving lives to bother with poisoning mistresses. The physician arrived an hour later. He was an elderly man named Dr. Grumblethorpe or something equally Dickensian, and he carried a bag that smelled strongly of dried herbs and despair. "Now, Your Grace," he said, peering at me through spectacles that were so thick they made his eyes look like dinner plates. "Let us see to your vitals. I suspect a heavy dose of mercury is needed to balance your humors." I recoiled. "Mercury, my dear man. Unless you want to turn my nervous system into a bowl of jelly, I suggest you put that bottle away. And as for my humors, they are perfectly balanced. Thank you very much. I'm feeling quite sunny, with a chance of light showers later this afternoon." Dr. Grumblethorpe blinked. "But the vapors, the hysteria." "You fainted in a fountain." "I was merely testing the water pressure," I said firmly. "Now give me that stethoscope." "Oh wait, you don't have one, do you?" "How tragic. No matter, lend me your wrist." Before he could protest, I grabbed his arm and checked his pulse. A bit thready. You're working too hard, doctor. And you really should wash your hands. There's a bit of something green under your fingernails that looks suspiciously like gangrene in waiting." The doctor looked at his hands, then at me, then back at his hands. "The Duchess, she knows of the green malady." "I know a lot of things," I said, leaning in and whispering. "I know that if you boil your bandages before you use them, people stop dying of the fever. It's like magic, only it's actually just basic hygiene. Science is wonderful, isn't it? It's like the universe's way of saying I told you so." I spent the next 20 minutes explaining the germ theory of disease to a man who thought illnesses were caused by bad smells and planetary alignments. By the time I was finished, Dr. Grumblethorpe looked as though he had been struck by lightning, the good kind, the kind that makes you want to go home and rethink your entire life. "You are a marvel," he whispered. "I'm just a woman who appreciates a clean workspace," I replied. "Now about that toast." The next few days were a whirlwind of domestic insurrection. I discovered that the Ravenhall kitchen was a haven for bacteria and that the servants were all terrified of the Mad Duchess. I spent my time wandering the halls, offering medical advice to the footmen and teaching the laundry maids how to make soap that actually cleaned things instead of just moving the dirt around. I also discovered that Alistair had a mistress named Lady Clarissa. She was a woman who looked like a very expensive porcelain doll, pretty, fragile, and likely to crack if you spoke too loudly. She visited the estate 3 days after my awakening. I met her in the rose garden. She was wearing a dress of pale pink silk and was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief when she saw me. "Beatrice," she gasped, her voice like a tinkling bell. I heard you were unwell. I came to offer my sympathies." I looked at her. She was terrified of me. The old Beatrice would have probably tried to push her into the koi pond. "Clarissa," I cried, trotting over and giving her a warm hug. She stiffened as if I were a giant python. "How lovely to see you. You look a bit peaked, dear. Are you getting enough iron? You should eat more spinach or perhaps some liver. Although liver is a bit of an acquired taste. Like jazz or modern art." Clarissa pulled back, her eyes wide. You aren't angry about the Duke?" I waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, Alistair, he's a grown man. If he wants to spend his time brooding in libraries with pretty ladies, that's his business. Besides, I've decided that being a jealous wife is far too much exercise. It's bad for the complexion. Makes you get those little lines between your eyebrows, and nobody wants those." Clarissa looked completely baffled. But you loved him. Love is a very complex chemical reaction, I said thoughtfully. It's mostly oxytocin and dopamine playing a prank on your brain. I've decided to focus on more stable chemicals. Like sodium bicarbonate, it's much more reliable. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Between you and me, Clarissa, Alistair needs a hobby. Maybe you could buy him some paints, or a very small dog. Something he can look after that won't talk back to him. Before she could respond, Alistair himself appeared at the end of the garden path. He stopped dead when he saw us, his mad wife and his mistress standing together, looking for all the world like two old friends discussing the weather. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, stridelonging toward us. "We're talking about spinach, Alistair," I said brightly. "Did you know it's very good for the blood? You should try some. It might help with that permanent scowl you're wearing. It's quite deep today. Are you having a difficult Tuesday?" Alistair looked from me to Clarissa, his confusion evident. Clarissa looked as though she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. "Beatrice, go to your rooms," Alistair said. Though his voice lacked its usual bite, he seemed more exhausted than angry. "I can't," I said. "I have a surgery scheduled." The Duke froze. "A surgery?" "Yes, the head gardener's son has a nasty abscess on his leg. If it isn't drained and cleaned properly, he'll lose the limb. And since Dr. Grumblethorpe is currently at home boiling his laundry, I've decided to step in. I've sharpened a very nice paring knife and sterilized some silk thread." "You will do no such thing," Alistair roared. "You are a duchess, not a village healer." I looked him straight in the eye. For a moment, the bubbly, silly girl vanished, and the scalpel looked out from behind Beatrice's blue eyes. "Alistair," I said, my voice cool and precise, "I can either spend my day being a duchess and annoying you, or I can spend it being a doctor and saving a boy's leg. Which do you think is a better use of my time, or yours?" The silence that followed was long and heavy. Alistair stared at me, his jaw working. He saw something in my gaze that he hadn't seen before, a competence, a cold, hard intelligence that didn't fit the image of the vapid girl he had married. "If you kill him," he whispered, "there will be no protecting you from the scandal." "I don't need protecting," I said, turning away. "I need a clean cloth and a bottle of your strongest brandy. Not for the boy, for me. It's been a very long morning." I walked away, leaving the Duke and his mistress standing amongst the roses. I had a rebellion to start, after all, and it was going to be the most hygienic rebellion the kingdom had ever seen. The surgery was a success. Naturally, there is something incredibly satisfying about being the only person in a 500-mile radius who understands how a circulatory system works. The gardener's son was sitting up and eating an apple by nightfall, and the story of the miracle Duchess began to spread through the servants' quarters like a very benevolent virus. That night, I sat in my room, drinking a cup of tea that I had brewed myself. The kitchen staff still couldn't get the temperature right. I looked out at the moon over the Ravenhall towers. "Well, Penelope," I whispered to the stars, "Phase 1 is complete. People think you're mad, but they also think you're a saint. It's a very powerful combination. Mad saints are much harder to execute than regular ones." I knew the road ahead would be difficult. There were political factions to navigate, a husband who was as stubborn as a mule and twice as handsome, and the ever-present danger of being found out as a witch or a heretic. But as I tucked myself into my pomegranate red bed, I couldn't help but feel a surge of genuine excitement. Life in Ethelgard was going to be an adventure. It was like a new research project, only with more corsets and fewer safety regulations. I closed my eyes, a small, mischievous smile playing on my lips. "Watch out, Alistair," I murmured into my pillow. The Duchess isn't just rebelling against you. She's rebelling against the entire Middle Ages, and I've brought my own scalpels." In the distance, an owl hooted. It sounded like it was laughing. Or perhaps it was just a very philosophical owl, pondering the absurdity of existence. Either way, I liked it. Tomorrow, I decided, I would see about building a microscope. Or perhaps I'd just start by teaching the cook how to make a proper hollandaise sauce. One must have priorities. After all, a revolution is all well and good, but one cannot rebel on an empty stomach. I fell asleep dreaming of penicillin and silk ribbons, a divine physician in a world of shadows, ready to light a match and watch the old world burn beautifully, cleanly, and with just the right amount of sarcasm. The next morning, the sun rose over Ravenhall, unaware that its mistress was no longer a victim of fate, but its new architect. And as the birds began to sing, I woke up, stretched my tiny, delicate arms, unprepared to do something truly dangerous. I was going to be kind, and I was going to be very, very clever. "Good morning, world," I chirped to the empty room. "Let's see who we can save today. And if we can't save them, let's at least make sure their bandages match their outfits." Aesthetics are important. You know, they're the garnish on the dish of life. And with that, the Duchess of Ravenhall rose to meet her destiny, one well-placed stitch at a time. The velvet curtains of the master suite at Ravenhall were heavy enough to dampen the sound of a small explosion, and they certainly did a magnificent job of trapping the scent of stale lavender and centuries of aristocratic boredom. I wrestled with them first thing, tugging the gold-tasseled cords until the morning sun crashed into the room like a physical blow. It was a bright, unapologetic sort of sun, the kind that didn't care about Duke Alistair's brooding or the fact that I had spent half the night sanitizing a gardener's boy with nothing but sheer willpower and high-proof brandy. "Good morning, dust motes," I chirped, watching them dance in the light. "You have a very important job today. You are going to remind everyone that even the smallest things can cause a massive sneeze of change." Mabel, my personal maid, scurried into the room with a tray of lukewarm tea. She looked as though she expected me to throw a shoe at her. The previous Beatrice, the one who had occupied this body before my soul took a wrong turn at the celestial crossroads, was apparently quite fond of throwing footwear. "Your Grace," Mabel whispered, her eyes fixed firmly on the floral carpet. "The Duke, he is in the breakfast room. He requested your presence most urgently." Urgently? How exciting. I skipped over to the wash basin. Is there a fire, a dragon? Or has he simply run out of things to scowl at? Scowling must be very exhausting for the facial muscles. It leads to premature wrinkling, and in this era, we don't even have decent moisturizer. It's a tragedy, Mabel, a literal, anatomical tragedy. Mabel blinked, her mouth hanging open just a fraction. "Moisturizer, Your Grace." "Never mind. We shall start a revolution of the epidermis later. For now, soap, real soap." "Mabel, not that scented lard the laundry maids use. I want something that actually lathers. If I can't see bubbles, I don't feel like I've truly conquered the day's bacteria." I spent the next 20 minutes convincing a bewildered Mabel that my sudden interest in hygiene wasn't a symptom of brain fever. To be fair, in the year of our Lord whatever century this was, the calendars were dreadfully ornate and confusing. Wanting to be clean was often considered a precursor to heresy. But if I was going to be a mad saint, I was going to be a squeaky clean one. I dressed in a gown of pale primrose silk, which felt entirely too much like being wrapped in a very expensive lemon, and made my way downstairs. Ravenhall was a labyrinth of cold stone and warm resentment. Every portrait on the wall seemed to watch me with a mixture of disapproval and envy. I gave a small wave to a particularly grim-looking ancestor with a very large ruff. "Chin up, Sir Reginald," I murmured. "The ruff is a bold choice. but it does make you look like a very angry carnation. I reached the breakfast room and pushed the heavy oak doors open. Alistair was there, looking infuriatingly handsome in a charcoal grey frock coat. He was reading a dispatch, his brow furrowed in that way that made him look like a brooding thunderstorm. Sitting across from him was Lady Elara Vane, the mistress who seemed to have more lace on her bodice than there was in the entire city of London. "Ah, the happy couple," I exclaimed, sliding into a chair with a flourish that nearly knocked over the silver cream jug. "And Elara, you look lovely. That shade of pink almost masks the fact that you haven't slept. Are you getting enough iron? You look a bit peaked. I recommend spinach. Though I suspect the cook here thinks vegetables are merely decorations for the roast beef." Alistair looked up, his grey eyes narrowing. "Beatrice, you are late, and you are talking. I find it helps the air move around," I said, reaching for a piece of dry toast. "If we don't speak, the silence just sits there like a heavy pudding. And nobody likes a heavy pudding at 9 in the morning, except perhaps the dogs." "We were discussing the gardener's boy," Alistair said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, low register he used when he wanted to intimidate people. "The servants are talking, Beatrice. They say you cut into him with a knife. They say you used magic to stop the bleeding." "Magic? Oh, don't be silly," I giggled, though my eyes remained sharp. "Magic is for people who don't understand basic anatomy. I simply applied a bit of pressure and some very clever stitching. It's called not letting the life fluid leak out. It's a very advanced concept. I know, perhaps I should draw you a diagram. I'm quite good with charcoal, though I tend to get it on my sleeves." Elara let out a delicate, tittering laugh. "Your Grace, you really must stop these pranks. People will think you've lost your mind. Imagine a duchess playing at being a surgeon. It's almost as ridiculous as a horse trying to play the harpsichord." I turned my brightest, most vacuous smile on her. "Oh, Elara, you're so right. A horse's hooves are far too large for the keys. But my hands are just the right size for a scalpel, and for fixing that slightly uneven embroidery on your collar. It's been bothering me since I sat down. It's a millimeter off. It's like a tiny scream for help from the thread." Elara's hand flew to her neck, her face flushing. Alistair slammed his hand on the table, making the spoons jump. "Enough. You will remain in your quarters for the rest of the day. I will not have you wandering the grounds, interfering with the staff and filling their heads with nonsense about hygiene and circulatory systems." I leaned back, nibbling my toast thoughtfully. "Alistair, darling, you can lock the doors. But you can't lock the air, and the air in this house is terrible. It's full of damp and old grudges. I've decided to start a new hobby. I'm going to renovate the kitchens." "The kitchens?" He stared at me as if I'd suggested I was going to fly to the moon on a tea tray. "Yes, they are a biohazard. I saw a cockroach yesterday that I'm fairly certain was wearing a tiny crown. He was the king of the larder. Alistair, I cannot coexist with a monarch of the insect world. It's a conflict of interest." "You will stay out of the kitchens," he hissed. Of course," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirts. "I'll just go and see Pip first. The boy I magically saved. I need to check his sutures. If I don't, his leg might fall off, and then we'd have to find a very small wooden one. And the carpentry bills in this place are already astronomical." I didn't wait for his permission. I spun on my heel and marched out, my heart thumping a happy little rhythm against my ribs. Being the Mad Duchess was incredibly liberating. When people think you're insane, you can tell them the truth, and they just assume it's a metaphor. I bypassed the main stairs and slipped down the back corridor toward the kitchens. The smell hit me before I reached the door, a mix of roasting fat boiled cabbage and a century's worth of floor grime. I pushed the door open to find Mrs. Higgins, the head cook, screaming at a kitchen boy who looked like he'd been washed in soot. "Stop," I cried, striking a dramatic pose. "In the name of the great whisk of fate, stop." The entire kitchen froze. Mrs. Higgins, a woman whose arms were the size of my thighs and whose face was a permanent shade of sunset purple, turned to me. "Your Grace, this is no place for a lady." "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Higgins, it's a place for a scientist. Or at least someone who doesn't want to die of salmonella. Tell me, do we wash the floor every day? Or do we just wait for the layers of grease to form a protective geological strata?" Mrs. Higgins squinted at me. "We sweeps it, Your Grace, when the mood takes us." "Well, today, the mood is taking me, and it's bringing a bucket and some vinegar." I rolled up my silk sleeves, ignoring the collective gasp of the staff. "First, we are going to talk about the Hollandaise. A sauce, Mrs. Higgins, is like a marriage. It requires a delicate balance of heat and agitation. If you rush it, it curdles. If you neglect it, it goes cold. And currently, the state of the Ravenhall kitchens is very, very curdled. For the next 2 hours, I was a whirlwind of terrifying efficiency. I didn't just tell them what to do, I showed them. I explained that germs were like tiny, invisible demons that loved dirt. Since the staff were all terrified of demons, they took to the scrubbing with a fervor usually reserved for Sunday Mass. "Think of the soap as holy water," I cheered, perched on a flour sack while I supervised the boiling of the copper pots. "Every bubble is a prayer for a clean colon. Scrub, my children, scrub for the glory of a stomach that doesn't ache." In the middle of my sermon on the virtues of boiling water, the door creaked open. Alistair stood there, his jaw practically hitting his cravat. I was covered in a light dusting of flour, my hair was beginning to escape its pins, and I was holding a wooden spoon like a scepter. "Beatrice," he said, his voice trembling with what I hoped was admiration, but was likely just pure, unadulterated rage, "what are you doing?" "I'm making a proper Hollandaise, Alistair, and I'm saving your life. Did you know that the cutting board for the raw chicken was also being used for the bread? It's a miracle you haven't turned into a puddle of intestinal distress by now. I'm basically your guardian angel, only with more flour and a better understanding of cross-contamination." He walked toward me, his boots clicking on the newly scrubbed flagstones. The kitchen staff scrambled away like mice. He stopped inches from me, his shadow looming over my lemon-yellow form. "You are a duchess," he whispered, his eyes searching mine. "Why do you insist on acting like a scullery maid or a madwoman?" I looked up at him, my playful smile softening into something more sincere. "Because, Alistair, a duchess who does nothing is just a very expensive ornament. And I've always found ornaments to be terribly boring. They just sit there, gathering dust, until someone breaks them. I'd rather be the one doing the breaking or the fixing." I reached out and bopped him on the nose with the tip of my wooden spoon, leaving a small white dot of flour. "You have a bit of reform on your face, darling, it suits you." He froze. Nobody bopped the Duke of Ravenhall on the nose. It was probably a capital offense, but instead of calling for the guards, he simply stared at me, his hand rising to touch the spot of flour. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of confusion, a spark of something that wasn't anger. "You are not the woman I married," he said quietly. "Thank goodness for that," I jerked, jumping down from the flour sack. She sounded like a real bore. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go check on Pip, and after that, I think I'll see about building a microscope. I've a feeling there are some very interesting things living in the pond water that you really ought to meet." I skipped past him, humming a jaunty tune. As I reached the door, I turned back. "Oh, and Alistair, tell Alara that if she keeps wearing that corset so tight, she's going to displace her liver." It's a very important organ. It deals with all the bitterness in the body. She really shouldn't squash it. I left him standing in the middle of his own kitchen, surrounded by sparkling pots and confused servants. Phase 2 was going swimmingly. I had secured the kitchen, baffled the Duke, and successfully insulted the mistress with medical facts. As I walked out into the garden, the air felt fresher, the sun warmer. I found Pip sitting on a bench near the herb garden, his leg propped up on a stool. His father, Thomas, was standing nearby, looking at the boy as if he were a ghost returned from the grave. "Your Grace," Thomas fell to his knees as I approached. "Oh, get up. Thomas, the ground is damp, and I've just finished a lecture on joint health. Kneeling is terrible for the patella." I knelt down anyway, checking the bandages on Pip's leg. The wound was clean, no sign of infection. The boy looked pale, but bright-eyed. "Does it hurt, Pip?" I asked, my voice soft. "A bit, Your Grace," he whispered, "but the lady in my dream said it would be all right." "The lady in your dream?" I tilted my head. "Did she have a scalpel and a very sarcastic attitude?" The boy giggled. "She had light all around her like the sun." I smiled, patting his hand. "That was just the brandy, Pip. It does wonderful things for the imagination. Now, you two drink plenty of water and eat your greens, even if they taste like long clippings. They're full of the stuff that makes your blood strong." As I stood up, I looked back at the towering spires of Ravenhall. It was a fortress of the old world, a place of shadows and rigid rules. But here, in the dirt and the sunlight, I felt a surge of genuine, ridiculous joy. Life was absurd. I was a top-tier special agent trapped in the body of a flighty aristocrat in a world that thought leeches were the height of medical technology. It was a comedy of errors, a cosmic joke played on a grand scale. "Well, universe," I whispered, looking up at the sky. "If you wanted a show, you've picked the right lead actress. I'm going to turn this place into the cleanest, smartest, most awkwardly philosophical kingdom in history." I spent the afternoon in the library, which was a magnificent cavern of leather-bound books and neglected knowledge. I bypassed the poetry and the histories of minor wars and headed straight for the natural sciences, or what passed for them. The humors of the body," I read aloud, pulling a dusty tome from the shelf. "Apparently, I am currently suffering from an excess of yellow bile, which makes me inclined to anger and boldness." Well, they got the boldness right. But I'm not angry, I'm delighted. Anger is just a lack of creative problem solving. I sat on the floor, surrounded by books, and began to sketch. If I couldn't find a microscope, I'd have to grind the lenses myself. I needed glass, lead, and a very patient craftsman. I also needed a way to explain why I wanted to look at invisible monsters without getting burned at the stake. "Perhaps I'll tell them I'm looking for the footprints of angels," I mused, my charcoal pencil flying across the parchment. People love a bit of religious branding. The angelic magnifier, it has a nice ring to it. Hours passed. The shadows in the library lengthened, turning the gold leaf on the book spines into flickering fire. I was so engrossed in my designs for a basic centrifuge that I didn't hear the door open. "The librarian said you had moved in," a voice said. I looked up to see Alistair leaning against the doorframe. He had removed his coat, and his waistcoat was unbuttoned at the top. He looked less like a duke and more like a man who was deeply, profoundly tired. "The library is a very good place to move into," I said, not stopping my sketch. "It has all the best conversations, and none of them involve Illyra's lace collection." Alistair walked over and looked down at my drawings. He stood there for a long time, silent. "These are complex," he said finally. "What are they?" "They are tools for seeing the truth, Alistair. The world isn't just what we see with our eyes. There's a whole universe beneath the surface. Tiny things that build us up and tiny things that tear us down. I want to see them. I want to understand how to fight the things that make people die for no reason. He sat down on the floor beside me, heedless of his expensive trousers. It was the first time we had been on the same level, physically and perhaps metaphorically. Why, he asked. Why do you care? The Beatrice I knew cared only for silk ribbons and the seating charts at the winter ball. I put down my pencil and looked at him. The pseudo-philosophy and the bubbly mask slipped away for a moment. Because I know what it's like to be powerless. Alistair. I know what it's like to watch people suffer because of ignorance. And I've been given a second chance, or perhaps a first real chance, to do something about it. I'm not a duchess. Not really. I'm a doctor who happens to have a very nice wardrobe. Alistair reached out, his fingers brushing against the edge of the parchment. You speak as if you've lived 100 lives. Maybe I have, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Maybe we all have, and we just forget the boring parts. Like the parts where we were cabbages or particularly uninspired rocks. He let out a short, sudden laugh. It was a genuine sound, sharp and bright, a cabbage. Is that what you think I was in a past life? Oh, definitely, a very noble cabbage, very sturdy. Possibly a bit crunchy in the middle. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, the coldness in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a wary, flickering curiosity. I don't understand you, Beatrice. Good, I said, picking up my pencil again. Understanding is the end of the adventure. If you understood me, you'd get bored. And then you'd go back to Ilara and her displaced liver. And we can't have that. I need you to help me find a glassblower. A glassblower? He shook his head, but he didn't get up. You are going to be the death of me, aren't you? No, Alistair, I said, a mischievous glint returning to my eyes. I'm going to be the life of you and the life of this whole, dusty, beautiful kingdom. Now tell me, do you think we can convince the bishop that a microscope is a divine instrument? Or should we just tell him it's a very fancy monocle for God? Alistair sighed, but there was a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. A fancy monocle for God, heaven help us all. Oh, I think heaven is quite busy, I chirped, leaning my head against his shoulder for just a second. I think we're going to have to do this bit ourselves. The Duchess of Ravenhall and her Duke sat on the library floor, surrounded by old books and new dreams, while outside, the moon rose over a world that had no idea it was about to be thoroughly, scientifically, and quite adorably reinvented. One stitch, one bubble, and one very cheeky comment at a time. The silence of the library was no longer heavy. It felt like a soft woolen blanket draped over to people who had finally stopped shouting at the wind. Alistair's presence beside me was a strange thing, warm, solid, and smelling faintly of cedarwood and the lingering scent of old paper. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as I sketched. He was staring at my drawing of a double convex lens with an expression of profound bewilderment, as if I were trying to explain the concept of a Tuesday to a cat. The soul is like glass, you see, I said suddenly, tapping my chin with the end of my charcoal pencil. It starts as sand-grainy, irritating, and prone to getting into places it shouldn't be. But then you apply enough heat, enough pressure, and suddenly, you can see right through it. Unless you drop it. Then it's just a mess and you have to wear slippers, so you don't cut your toes. Alistair turned his head slowly to look at me. Is that the philosophy you've gathered from your afternoon amongst the scrolls, Beatrice? That we are all potentially floor hazards? Precisely. I beamed at him, my heart doing a little skip that I chose to blame on a lack of proper nutrition. We are all transparent mysteries, and right now, I need to see the transparency of the world. I need to see the things that are too small for the naked eye to acknowledge, If we can see the enemy, Alistair, we can fight it. It's very hard to punch a ghost. But if you give the ghost a hat, at least you know where its head is. He rubbed his temples, a small, tired smile playing on his lips. I suspect I am the ghost in this metaphor, and you are currently trying to fit me for a very large, very confusing hat. Oh, you'd look dashing in a hat, I chirped, tossing my pencil onto the parchment. But no more talk of ghosts. We have work to do. The sun will be up in a few hours, and I have a list of supplies that would make a master alchemist weep with envy. Or perhaps just confusion. Most people weep when they're confused, don't they? It's a very damp way to express intellectual struggle. I stood up, dusting off my skirts with a vigor that sent a small cloud of ancient library dust into the air. Alistair rose with me, his movements fluid and graceful, unlike my own, which were mostly composed of enthusiasm and a slight lack of spatial awareness. He reached out, steadying me as I tripped over the hem of my gown. "Oakhaven," he said softly. "There is a man there. A craftsman named Silas Penelagon. He used to make lenses for the Royal Observatory before he retired to the countryside to drink cider and argue with his goats. If anyone can make your fancy monocle for God, it is him. Silas Penelagon, what a marvelous name. It sounds like something you'd find at the bottom of a magical pond," I said, clapping my hands together. "We shall go at dawn, or perhaps slightly after dawn. Dawn is very early, and I feel my best ideas usually arrive after a second cup of tea and a particularly buttery crumpet." The rest of the night was a blur of frantic preparation. I didn't sleep. Sleep felt like a waste of perfectly good thinking time. Instead, I paced my chambers, my mind a whirlwind of formulas and anatomical diagrams. I thought about the world I had left behind, the sterile white halls of the hospital, the beep of monitors, the smell of antiseptic. Here, the world was raw and smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. It was terrifyingly beautiful. I felt like a small bird that had been accidentally tossed into a hurricane. But instead of being scared, I was busy trying to figure out the aerodynamics of the wind. When the first gray fingers of light began to poke through the heavy velvet curtains, I was already dressed. I chose a gown of simple, sturdy wool, something that screamed I am a serious woman of science rather than I spend for hours choosing lace. Though, I did add a small, jaunty ribbon to my hair, because even a revolutionary needs to feel a bit pretty. Alistair was waiting in the courtyard. The carriage was ready, the horse's breath misting in the cool morning air. He looked at me, his eyes taking in my disheveled hair and the smudge of ink on my cheek. "You look like you've been fighting a printing press," he remarked, though his tone was surprisingly gentle. "I won," I told him, stepping into the carriage. The printing press surrendered and gave me all its secrets. It was a very polite conquest. As the carriage rattled out of the Ravenhall gates, I leaned out of the window, watching the great stone lions of the estate fade into the mist. "Goodbye, lions. Don't do anything I wouldn't do." Which leaves you plenty of options, really. The journey to Oakhaven took several hours. The English countryside was a tapestry of rolling green hills, ancient oaks, and the occasional grumpy-looking sheep. I spent most of the journey explaining the circulatory system to Alistair using a handful of dried peas and a piece of string I found in my pocket. "You see, the heart is like a very busy postman," I explained, waving a pea around. "It delivers all the good news to the toes and the fingers, and then it goes back to get more news. If the postman gets tired, the toes get grumpy, and when toes get grumpy, they turn blue. It's all very logical if you don't think about it too hard." Alistair watched the peas with a look of intense concentration. "And the bad air theory the royal physicians swear by." "The air isn't bad, Alistair. It's just crowded." It's full of tiny little guests who didn't RSVP to the party. We call them germs, but I like to think of them as very small, very rude tourists who refuse to leave the hotel. He leaned back against the leather cushions, his gaze fixed on me. Where did you learn these things, Beatrice? Truly, you speak of the body as if you've seen it from the inside out. I went still for a moment, the pea frozen in mid-air. I have a very vivid imagination, I said, my voice dropping an octave. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see things that haven't happened yet. Or things that happened a long time ago in a place that doesn't exist. It's a bit like having a library in your head, but all the books are written in a language you only half understand. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. It was just a very poetic way of saying I was a transmigrated soul with a medical degree and a penchant for melodrama. I think, Alistair said, his voice barely audible over the clatter of the wheels, that you are the most dangerous person I have ever met, not because you have power, but because you have ideas. Power can be taken away. Ideas are like weeds. They grow through the cracks in the pavement. I like weeds, I whispered. They have more personality than roses. Roses are just show-offs. Oakhaven was a village that looked as if it had been built by someone who had a very loose relationship with straight lines. The cottages leaned against each other like tired drunkards, and the streets were paved with cobblestones that seemed to have a personal vendetta against carriage wheels. We found Silas Penhaligon's workshop at the end of a winding lane, tucked behind a massive weeping willow. It was a small, soot-stained building with a chimney that belched out colorful puffs of smoke, sometimes blue, sometimes a suspicious shade of magenta. Alistair knocked on the heavy oak door. There was a sound of crashing glass, a muffled curse, and then the door creaked open. A man stood there, his hair a wild thicket of white, his spectacles perched precariously on the end of a nose that looked like it had been broken at least 3 times. He was wearing an apron covered in strange, crystalline stains. "Go away," he grumbled. "The goats are already fed, and I've already told the vicar that I won't make him a glass eye that glows in the dark. It's unholy and it's tacky." "Silas," Alistair said, stepping forward. "It's Alistair Thorne." The old man squinted through his thick lenses. "The Duke, what do you want? Come to collect taxes?" "I've only got 3 shillings and a very talented chicken." "I don't want your chicken, Silas. I want your skill. My wife has an idea." Silas looked at me then. I stepped forward, offering my most charming, slightly insane but harmless smile. "Hello, I'm Beatrice. I've heard you're the only man in the kingdom who can turn sand into magic. I need a lens, a very specific lens, one that can see the invisible." Silas snorted. "The invisible? You want to see ghosts, do you? Another one for the spirit world nonsense." "No ghosts," I said, stepping past him into the workshop before he could protest. The room was a marvel of chaos. Glass tubes, glowing crucibles, and heaps of discarded shards filled every corner. I want to see the things that are too small to be ghosts. I want to see the architecture of life itself. I want to see the little dots that make up the world. I pulled out my sketches and spread them across a workbench cluttered with iron tongs. Silas leaned over them, his grumpiness momentarily forgotten. He traced the lines of my diagrams with a blackened finger. "This curvature," he muttered, "it's extreme. It would distort the light unless the clarity of the glass was absolute." "Exactly," I chirped, bouncing on the balls of my feet. "It needs to be as clear as a secret kept by a mute. We need to grind it, polish it, and then treat it with the respect one usually reserves for a very fragile grandmother." Silas looked up at me, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. "You know about refraction. You know about focal lengths. Who taught you this? Women are supposed to know about embroidery and how to faint gracefully. I'm terrible at fainting, I confessed. I always end up hitting my head on something sharp. It's much more efficient to stay upright and argue. As for the science, I think I must have swallowed a very intelligent book. When I was a child, it's been whispering to me ever since. Silas barked a laugh. A book eater, I like that. All right, Duchess, I'll help you, but it'll cost you. Not gold. I've no use for gold in this muddy hole. What then? Alistair asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his protective instincts clearly flaring up. Silas pointed at me. I want to know what you see. When you look through the glass, I want you to tell me if the world is as ugly on the inside as it is on the outside. I've spent 50 years making things for people to look at the stars, but I've never looked at a drop of water. I want to know if there's a heaven in a puddle. I felt a lump in my throat. This grumpy, cider-drinking old man was a philosopher in disguise. Silas, I said softly, I promise you, the world in a puddle is more beautiful than all the stars in the sky. It's a crowded, busy, wonderful mess. It's like a ballroom. But the dancers are all invisible and nobody knows the steps. Well then, Silas said, grabbing a pair of tongs, let's get the fire started. Duke, you can pump the bellows, try not to break them. They're older than you and significantly more useful. The next few hours were a symphony of heat and light. I watched, mesmerized, as Silas worked the molten glass. He was an artist, his movements precise and rhythmic. Alistair, the powerful Duke of Ravenhall, was indeed pumping the bellows, sweat beading on his forehead, his fine linen shirt clinging to his back. It was a sight that made my heart do that strange little dance again. You're doing a wonderful job, Alistair. I cheered from the sidelines. You have a real talent for air movement. If the dukedom fails, you could always find work as a very handsome fan. I am glad my efforts amuse you, he panted, though there was no malice in his voice. As the sun began to set, Silas held up a small, glowing orb of glass with his tongs. He began the long, slow process of cooling and grinding. It was tedious work, requiring a level of patience I usually only reserved for waiting for my hair to dry. I sat on a stool, swinging my legs and eating an apple I had found in the carriage. Do you think, I asked, looking at the glowing glass, that everything in the world is just waiting to be discovered, like, maybe there's music in the wine that we just don't have the ears to hear. Or maybe the trees are talking about us behind our backs. Look at those humans. They'd say they move so fast. They must be very stressed. I think, Alistair said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief, that the trees would probably complain about your constant chattering, Beatrice. I don't chatter, I provide a continuous narrative of existence. It's a service I provide for free. You're welcome. Silas stopped his grinding for a moment. It's ready for the first polish. But it won't be finished tonight. Glass is like a woman, Duchess. You can't rush it, or it'll crack just to spite you. I shall return tomorrow then, I declared. And I shall bring more apples, and perhaps some of that cider you like. I hear it's very good for the intellectual humours. As we walked back to the carriage, the village of Oakhaven was bathed in the orange glow of twilight. I felt a sense of triumph so intense it was almost dizzying. I was doing it. I was actually doing it. I was going to bring science to this world of lace and superstition. Beatrice, Alistair said as he helped me into the carriage. He didn't let go of my hand immediately. His palm was warm and calloused from the bellows. Why does this matter so much to you? You could have anything. Jewels, lands, the finest carriages in the kingdom. Why do you want to spend your days in a soot-stained workshop looking at puddles? I looked at him, the bubbly mask falling away for a second. The evening light caught the depths of his eyes, and for a moment, I felt like he was the one looking through a microscope, trying to see the truth of me. Because, Alistair, I said, my voice steady. Jewels don't save lives. Lands don't cure the fever. And carriages don't stop a mother from crying over a child she couldn't protect. I've seen enough of that. I want to be the person who brings the light. Not just the person who wears the diamonds that reflect it. He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, he slowly raised my hand and pressed his lips to my knuckles. It wasn't a formal gesture, it was something else. Something that felt like an alliance. Then we shall bring the light, he whispered. The ride back to Ravenhall was quiet. I leaned my head against the window, watching the stars come out. I thought about Silas, about the glass, and about the rude tourists I was going to evict from the human body. But mostly, I thought about the man sitting across from me. The Duke of Ravenhall was not the cold, distant man I had read about in the metaphorical history books of this world. He was a man who would pump bellows for a woman he didn't understand, just because she had a sparkle in her eye and a sketch of a lens in her hand. When we arrived back at the estate, the servants were scurrying about, preparing for dinner. Elara was waiting in the foyer, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. She looked at our soot-stained clothes and Alistair's dishevelled appearance with a horror that was almost comical. "Alistair," she cried, rushing forward. "What has happened? You look like you've been working in a coal mine. And Beatrice, your hair is a disaster. It's called the scientific aesthetic, Elara," I said, breezing past her with a grin. "It's all the rage in the places where people actually think. And as for my hair, it's just expressing its individuality. You should try it sometime. Your hair looks like it's being held hostage by those pins." Elara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Alistair, are you going to let her speak to me this way?" Alistair didn't even look at her. He was still looking at me, a strange, half-smile on his face. "I think, Elara, that Beatrice has far more important things to worrying about than hairpins. She is busy reinventing the world. The least we can do is stay out of her way." I gave him a cheeky wink and headed up the stairs, my heart lighter than it had been into lifetimes. I had an ally, I had a glassblower, and I had a very large, very beautiful library that was waiting for me to fill it with the truth. As I reached the landing, I paused and looked down at them. "Woe on Elara." She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "If you see a postman in your toes, let me know. It's a very serious condition, Toodles." I skipped down the hallway, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. I had a microscope to build, a kingdom to save, and a dupe to thoroughly confuse. It was going to be a very busy week. And maybe, just maybe, I'd find time to figure out why my heart kept doing that annoying little flip every time Alistair Thorne looked at me, probably just a minor arrhythmia. I'd have to check my pulse. Or maybe I just needed another crumpet. Yes, definitely a crumpet. The universe always made more sense when there was butter involved. I reached my room and collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the canopy. The world was a giant, swirling mystery, and I was the girl with the magnifying glass. I wasn't just Beatrice, the disgraced Duchess. I was Beatrice, the woman of the lens. And I was going to make sure that from now on, everyone from the king on his throne to the smallest child in the village could see the magic in the muck. Because the truth isn't just out there in the stars. It's right here, in the dust on the floor and the breath in our lungs. And if I had to break a few social rules and ruin a few silk gowns to find it, then so be it. After all, what's a little soot compared to the soul of the world? I drifted off to sleep with the smell of wood smoke in my hair and the image of a noble cabbage dancing in my head. Tomorrow, the glass would be clear. Tomorrow, the invisible would become visible. And tomorrow, I'd have to figure out how to explain to the cook why I needed 12 dozen glass jars and a very large magnifying glass for spiritual research. "It's for the angels," I murmured into my pillow, a sleepy smile tugging at my lips. "They're very small, and they've lost their keys. I'm just helping them find them." The moon shone through the window, casting a long, silvery light across the floor of the room where a duchess dreamed of molecules, and a duke, standing in the hallway outside, wondered for the first time in his life if he had finally met someone who was more powerful than a crown. The revolution had begun, and it smelled like cider, hot glass, and a very, very cheeky sense of hope. One lens at a time, the darkness was being pushed back, replaced by the bright, bubbly, and utterly relentless light of a woman who refused to believe that the world was anything less than extraordinary. And as the clocks in Ravenhall chimed the midnight hour, the gears of fate turned, perfectly aligned, ready for the wonders yet to come. Golly, I thought just before I plunged into deep sleep, I hope Silas remembers the apple cider. It really does help with the grinding. And then there was only the sound of the wind in the oaks, whispering secrets that I would soon be able to read like an open book. The future was coming, and it was going to be absolutely, scientifically, magnificently adorable. No doubt about it, none at all. Just wait and see. Or rather, wait and really see. Through a lens, darkly. No, through a lens, brilliantly. That was much better. I'd have to write that down. Tomorrow, definitely tomorrow. After the crumpets, always after the crumpets. The sunlight that streamed through the heavy velvet curtains of Ravenhall the next morning was not merely light. It was a personal invitation from the universe to go and poke things with a stick. I sat up, my hair a spectacular bird's nest of ambition and stray feathers from the pillow, and declared to the empty room that today was the day the invisible world would finally have to start paying rent. Being a disgraced Duchess turned clandestine scientist was, I decided, much more exhausting than being a special agent. In my previous life, I could just kick a door down. Here, I had to politely ask the door if it wouldn't mind opening while I carried a tray of highly unstable glass vials and a half-eaten scone. I hopped out of bed, my toes curling against the cold stone floor. Right then, I muttered, pointing a finger at my reflection in the silver-backed mirror. First, we find the jars. Second, we find Silas. Third, we convince the Duke that I haven't actually lost my marbles, merely rearranged them into a more aesthetically pleasing pattern. My reflection looked skeptical. It probably wanted a hairbrush. I ignored it. I dressed myself in a gown of sturdy, sensible wool, though I did sneak a pair of trousers on underneath, because one never knows when one might need to climb a tree or flee from a particularly judgmental butler. I hurried down to the kitchens, the scent of baking bread acting as a compass for my soul. Mrs. Higgins, the cook, was a woman built like a fortress and possessed of a temper that could boil water at 20 paces. She was currently attacking a mound of dough as if it had insulted her grandmother. "Mrs. Higgins, you look radiant. Is that a new apron? It really brings out the don't mess with me in your eyes," I chirped, sliding into the pantry. Mrs. Higgins paused, flour puffing up around her like a defensive cloud. "Your Grace, what are you doing in the bowels of the house at this hour? Shouldn't you be upstairs embroidering a doily or something equally useless?" "Doilies are the enemies of progress, Mrs. Higgins," I said, already rummaging through a crate of empty preserve jars. "I am on a mission of the utmost spiritual importance. I need these jars, all of them, and perhaps a bit of that string." "Spiritual?" she asked, her eyebrows migrating toward her hairline. "Yes, you see, the angels have lost their keys, very tiny keys. I'm building a celestial retrieval device. It requires glass, lots of it. And maybe a bit of apple cider for energy, for the angels. You understand, they get quite parched." She stared at me for a long beat. In any other world, I would have been committed to a very damp asylum. But in this one, my sheer confidence seemed to act as a localized reality distortion field. Mrs. Higgins sighed, wiped her hands on her apron, and shoved a basket of jars toward me. Just take Your Grace. If it keeps you out of my larder and stops you from trying to optimize the butter churn again, you can have the whole cellar. You are a saint, a flower-covered, magnificent saint. I kissed her on the cheek, which caused her to turn a very interesting shade of beetroot and beat a hasty retreat toward the stables where Silas, the glassblower I'd practically kidnapped into service, was waiting. Silas was a man of few words and much soot. He was currently staring at a furnace with the kind of intensity most men reserved for their firstborn children. When he saw me, he held up a cooling rod. At the end of it sat a thick, circular disc of glass, glowing with a dull, internal amber light. Is it? I whispered, leaning in. It's clear as a winter's morning, Your Grace, Silas grunted. Ground it myself. My fingers feel like they've been through a pepper mill, but it's flat as a pancake in a press. I took the glass disc with trembling hands. It was heavy, cool, and perfectly smooth. This was the heart of it, the lens. The piece of magic that would bridge the gap between what we thought we knew and what actually existed. Silas, you're a genius. When I'm queen of the lab, I'm giving you a medal made of solid chocolate. I'd prefer a pint of ale and a nap. If it's all the same to you, he muttered, though I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. I spent the next 6 hours in a fever of activity. I had commandeered a small potting shed near the edge of the estate, turning it into a makeshift laboratory. It was glorious. There were jars of pond water, scrapings from the underside of a particularly mossy rock, and a very confused ladybird I'd named Sir Lancelot, who was currently residing in a matchbox. I rigged up the wooden frame I'd spent the previous night carving. It was a crude thing, held together by luck, twine, and my own stubbornness. I positioned the lens, adjusted the mirror to catch the afternoon sun, and placed a single drop of water from the estate's fountain onto a sliver of glass. I leaned down, I squinted, I turned a small wooden screw. The world blurred, it wobbled, it screamed in protest. And then, suddenly, it snapped into focus. I gasped, my heart did that annoying flip-flop thing again. But this time it wasn't because of the Duke, it was because of the universe. There, in a tiny, insignificant drop of water, was a riot. A circus of tiny, transparent beasts darting to and fro, spinning like dervishes, living their entire, complex lives in a space no bigger than a pinhead. Oh, you beauties, I whispered, my eyes stinging. Look at you go, you don't even know you're famous. Who is famous? I jumped so high I nearly knocked Sir Lancelot off the table. Alistair Thorne was standing in the doorway of the shed, his broad shoulders blocking out half the light. He looked entirely out of place amidst the pots of dirt and smelling salts, his silk waistcoat shimmering in the gloom. Alistair, you mustn't sneak up on a woman when she's communing with the microscopic. I clutched my chest. You nearly gave me a heart attack. Do you have any idea how hard it is to restart a heart with only a tea strainer and a prayer? He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the chaos of my laboratory. I was told you were in here talking to the angels. Mrs. Higgins seemed concerned. She said you were looking for their keys. I waved a hand dismissively. That was just a metaphor, or a lie. It's hard to tell the difference when you're caffeinated. Come here, you have to see this. He hesitated. Beatrice, Elara is organizing a garden party for the local gentry. She's currently telling everyone that you've taken up extreme gardening as a hobby to cope with your delicate mental state. Let her talk. Elara's mind is like a very expensive handbag, pretty on the outside, but contains nothing but a few crumbs and a crumpled receipt. I said. grabbing his sleeve and pulling him toward the microscope. "Look through this. Now don't argue with a woman holding a magnifying glass, Alistair. It's bad for your humors." With a look of profound skepticism, the Duke of Ravenhall leaned over my rickety wooden contraption. He squinted into the lens. For a moment, he said nothing, then his entire body went still. He adjusted the screw, his long fingers moving with surprising delicacy. He stayed like that for a full minute, his breath hitching in his chest. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wide, the dark pupils blown with shock. What are they? They're moving, they're alive. They're everything," I said, my voice soft. "They're the reason food rots. They're the reason we get sick. They're the reason the soil grows. There is an entire kingdom right under our noses, Alistair. And we've been ignoring it because we were too busy worrying about the shade of our waistcoats." He looked back down at the lens, then at me. "You didn't find this in a book. You didn't learn this at a finishing school. I found it in the truth," I said, leaning back against the workbench. "The world isn't what they tell us it is. It's bigger, smaller, and much more ridiculous than any of us can imagine. And I'm going to show them, all of them." Alistair stepped closer. The air in the shed suddenly felt very warm, smelling of cedarwood and the sharp tang of ozone. "They'll call you a witch, Beatrice, or a madwoman. The church won't like you claiming there are invisible monsters in the holy water. Then I'll tell them the monsters are just very small pilgrims," I countered, my chin lifting. "I'm not afraid of them, Alistair. I've died once already, metaphorically speaking, and I can tell you, the afterlife is surprisingly lacking in good tea. I'm not going to waste this life being quiet." He reached out, his thumb grazing my cheek, wiping away a smudge of soot I hadn't known was there. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated connection that made my brain feel like it was sparkling. "You are the most infuriating, brilliant, and utterly terrifying woman I have ever met," he murmured. "And I suspect that if I don't help you, you'll simply burn the palace down to see what color the flames are." "Blue, probably, if there's copper in the stonework," I whispered. He laughed, a deep, rich sound that made my toes tingle. "Then we shall have to make sure the world is ready for you. But first, we have a garden party to attend. Elara has invited the bishop. If you're going to start a revolution, you might as well start with the highest-ranking hat in the county." "A bishop? Splendid. I've always wanted to explain the concept of cellular division to a man who thinks the world was created in a weekend." I grabbed my microscope, now affectionately dubbed the Truth Teller, and tucked it under my arm. Alistair offered me his elbow, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a disgraced duchess being led to a social execution. I felt like a general heading into battle, armed with glass, light, and a very cheeky sense of destiny. The garden party was a sea of pastel silks, parasols, and the kind of forced laughter that makes your teeth ache. Elara was in her element, presiding over a tea service as if it were a religious rite. When she saw us approaching me, in my soot-stained wool, and Alistair, looking uncharacteristically rumpled, her smile sharpened into a blade. "Oh, Beatrice, how lovely of you to join us," she called out, her voice carrying across the lawn. "We were just discussing your unique interests. The bishop was quite fascinated to hear about your search for angel keys." The bishop, a portly man with a face like a very concerned ham, nodded gravely. "A curious pursuit, your grace, though perhaps one better suited to a chapel than a potting shed." The gathered guests tittered. I felt Alistair's arm stiffen beneath mine, but I just patted his hand. I stepped forward, placing my wooden contraption directly onto the lace-covered tea table, right next to the cucumber sandwiches. "My Lord Bishop," I said, my voice clear and bright, "you are quite right. The divine is often found in the most unexpected places, not just in the rafters of a cathedral, but in the very tea you are currently sipping. I beckoned him over. Would you care for a glimpse? It's a bit like looking into the mind of the Creator, only much more wiggly. The bishop blinked, looked at Alistair, who gave a subtle, encouraging nod and leaned over the lens. Silence fell over the garden. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping to see what would happen. The bishop stayed there for a long time. His face went from pale to pink, then to a very pale shade of green. He pulled back, gasping, clutching his pectoral cross. Great heavens, there are creatures in the water. They have tails. They're called microbes, your lordship, I said, beaming. And they're quite friendly, provided you boil the water first. If you don't, they tend to throw a very loud party in your digestive tract. That's probably why the Archdeacon had such a difficult time at the last Michaelmas feast. The guests erupted, not in laughter, but in a frantic, bubbling curiosity. They crowded around, jostling for a look. Elara was pushed to the periphery, her face a mask of cold fury as her carefully orchestrated social hierarchy collapsed in the face of a drop of pond water. Alistair stood by my side, a look of quiet triumph on his face. I believe, Elara, that the extreme gardening is going to be the talk of the season. You might want to order more magnifying glasses. It seems they're the new lace. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, I felt a sense of profound peace. I had a long way to go. There were diseases to cure, prejudices to shatter, and a duke to properly fall in love with, which, according to my internal calculations, was approximately 98% likely to happen within the next fortnight. But as I looked at the people crowded around my little wooden machine, seeing the wonder on their faces as they looked at the world for the first time, I knew I had won. I wasn't an agent anymore, and I wasn't just a duchess. I was the bridge between the seen and the unseen. I turned to Alistair, who was watching me with an expression that made my heart do a triple backflip. You know, I said, I think I figured out what that postman in the toes condition is. He raised an eyebrow. And what is the scientific diagnosis, Dr. Beatrice? It's called being alive, I said, leaning my head against his shoulder. It's a very rare condition, where you suddenly realize that every moment is a miracle, every crumb is a universe, and every person you meet is a mystery waiting to be solved. He wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me close. And the cure? There isn't one, I whispered, looking up at the first stars of the evening. But I've heard that a very large crumpet and a bit of cider can make the symptoms much more manageable. Then let us go and find some crumpets, he said. The universe can wait until after tea. I laughed, a bright, bubbly sound that echoed through the ancient oaks of Ravenhall. The future was unwritten, messy, and probably full of very small monsters. But as long as I had my lenses, my duke, and a steady supply of butter, I knew it was going to be absolutely, scientifically, magnificently perfect. Golly, I thought as we walked back toward the house, I really must remember to tell Silas about the chocolate medal. A man who can grind glass like that deserves at least a kilo of the good stuff. And maybe, just maybe, I'll find a way to see if those stars up there are made of diamonds, or just very, very bright ideas. One lens at a time, that was the secret. Because when you finally see the world for what it really is, you realize that the most beautiful thing about it isn't the magic, it's the truth. And the truth, as it turns out, is much more fun than a fairy tale. Especially when it involves wiggling things in your tea, Toodles.